President Obama wrapping up his speech in front of the United Nations General Assembly. And he touched on a lot of topics that we had expected when we spoke earlier to Margaret Brennan. One of the things that she said he would do is highlight some of his foreign policy successes. And he certainly mentioned the thawing of relations between Cuba. And I think his first applause line that he got was when he called on Congress to lift sanctions against Cuba. But of course, he talked a lot about Syria as well.
That's right. And we have with us our senior national security analyst, Juan Zarate, to help break this all down. Juan, thanks for being with us. We heard him talk about Syria. We heard him talk about Iran and Russia as well. What struck you from the president's comments today?
I think it's really the thematics of his speech. He's trying to deal with the realities of a world that are challenging the international norms and principles that we've relied on, that the United Nations in some ways is a key part of. You have China with its expansion of its islands in the South China Sea being more aggressive. You have Russia obviously more aggressive in Ukraine, reasserting itself in Syria. You have the threats of ISIS and transnational terrorist groups erasing the map in many ways and borders in the Middle East. And so I think the president was trying to sort of reassert not just the role of the United States, but the role of international norms and principles in the face of those challenges, and very much making a case at the very end that there are false prophets and fallen empires with respect to the use of brute force and power, and that what will lead to success in the 21st century is cooperation, coordination, and diplomacy. I think that's the core of his message. I think the reality, though, is that he's challenged on the ground with countries and groups that are not willing to play by the rules.
He seemed to be trying to make it clear that the U.S. cannot go it alone, that when things are happening in an individual country, it's affecting everyone globally, and you can't expect the U.S. to clean up the mess on their own.
That's absolutely right. And this is a theme you've heard from the president in a number of his addresses to the UN. The fact that the U.S. can't unilaterally solve global problems, though the world comes to the United States often as the global leader to solve hard problems. But things like climate change, the refugee crisis, the threat from ISIS, and other global issues like pandemics and health crises can't be solved only by the U.S. That's a given. And I think part of this is the president trying to make the case that the U.S. can't solve these problems, can't be everywhere at once. He's also trying to make the case that these big problems require all of the nations of the UN to actually work together. And so that's a core theme for the president, something he's stated today. It's something he's stated in years past.
I wanted to ask you about Russia, because the president very clearly said when it came to the Ukraine, he said, we cannot stand by when the sovereignty and territorial integrity of a nation is flagrantly violated. He said if that happens in Ukraine, it could happen to any nation here today. Obviously, some pointed comments directed at Russian President Vladimir Putin, who we should point out is expected to speak later today. It was interesting, Juan, because Charlie Rose was on with us earlier today, and he, of course, sat down with President Putin and talked about Russia, also Russia with respect to Syria and the Middle East. What did you make of President Obama's comments directed at Russia today?
Well, I think the president was trying to reassert the principles and policies that we've had with respect to Russia, in particular with Ukraine, a situation that hasn't resolved itself. Russia has annexed Crimea for all intents and purposes. And this is an unresolved problem for the international community, especially when the president is arguing that we have to respect international norms and law. That's exactly what the Russians have not done. But the president, at the same time, did talk about needing to cooperate on other issues. And he did talk about working with any country, to include Iran and Russia, on hard issues, things like Syria. And so I think the president's trying to walk a fine line here between reasserting U.S. policy and making the case against Russia, trying to argue that Russia remains isolated, while also arguing that we have to work with any and all stakeholders, like the Russians. And the reality here is that Vladimir Putin, in many ways, is the protagonist. He's driving the situation on the ground. And in some ways, the president's having to react, and the U.S. is having to react to what Russia is doing on the ground.
All right, Juan Zarate, thank you.